there's a lot of confusion surrounding this gospel text that we heard just now. Not least because we often make it part of the Christmas story, and the poor old Feast of Epiphany gets relegated to being Christmas's neglected younger sibling. But the story leaves us with quite a few questions. When did the Magi arrive? Nativity scenes have them there in the manger with the new parents and the shepherds trying to present gifts to a mother who's fresh out of labour, which seems ill-advised. But more likely, they visited sometime into Jesus' infancy, somewhere before he turned 2. How many were there? Again, nativity sets have you believe that there were 3, but we only think that because there were 3 gifts. The text doesn't actually tell us how many. Maybe there were just a couple of particularly generous magi, or maybe there were dozens of them, very stingy magi, who all pitched in for a measly 3 presents. And where did they come from? The East, we're told. And so we end up singing about 3 kings from the Orient, which brings me to the issue of who they were. Certainly not kings, and even wise men is a little indescript. Most likely they were Zoroastrians, the oldest extant religion in the world today, who read signs in the stars for prophetic wisdom and guidance. In today's parlance, astrologers. Which is particularly interesting because historically astrology and Christianity haven't had the best of relationships. And yet here, in the infancy narratives of Christ, some of the very first witnesses to the coming of the Messiah into the world are those who today a few Christians might look on with suspicion and not a little prejudice, maybe seeing astrologists as primitive at best, or snake oil peddling horoscope charlatans at worst. But holding aside for a moment our own, perhaps, prejudice or biases about astrology, take pause in what it means that some of the first guests at Christ's advent into the world were people of a wildly different religion. A religion that wasn't anticipating or looking toward the coming of a Jewish Messiah at the outskirts of the Roman Empire. Some of the first worshippers of Christ were not Christians, not Jews, not followers of Yahweh, but pilgrims of a foreign faith. And once they're done worshipping the infant Christ, the Magi return to their own country, where presumably they go on with the same old superstitious religious practices that somehow led them to Jesus in the first place. This story about visitors arriving from a foreign faith to worship Christ and then returning back home, seemingly unconverted, invites us to ask, how many ways are there to be Christian? How many routes to Christ are there, besides only the one in which we are most at home? Is ours the only way to truth? Or can Christ make himself known in the world in places and ways that not only take us by surprise, but actually scandalize our Christian sensibilities? Asking the question a slightly different way, does Christ belong to Christians? The New Testament church, exploding across the diverse, pluralistic landscape of the Roman world, ran into its first major controversy as they wrestled through the implications of what this free grace of God in Christ meant for life with non-Jewish people. A significant part of our New Testament is made up of the theological debates surrounding that question, and it's even where we get our first ecumenical council in Jerusalem. Ultimately, of course, the deciding vote is Paul's, and for that, all of us here who were not born Messianic Jews should be very grateful. The debate was mired in details about circumcision and non-circumcision, but behind all those disputes, the fundamental question the church was asking was, does one have to become Jewish in order to follow Christ? Or are there ways of following Jesus within one's non-Jewishness? The biggest opponents to Paul here were a sect of Christians who demanded that Gentile converts follow Jewish customs. Paul came up with a favorite slur for them, the circumcisers. They believed that being Christian meant being like them, which sounds really awful when enforcing uniformity requires some unpleasant surgery for those who weren't born Jewish. But actually, the desire for religious uniformity isn't foreign to us, is it? This heresy, the church's first heresy, is also the most enduring. It's the one that probably causes more problems today, 2,000 years later, than any other. And it goes on in the background without us even noticing. It's the reason so many people, particularly those who are marginalized, find themselves unable to step through the door of a church. Why? Because they don't look like the kind of people who go to church. They don't know how to fit in or find a spot on a pew without the whole community turning to observe the conspicuous other, the outsider, the one who doesn't look like what we've often constructed a Christian to look like. I think theirs is the same question as the New Testament churches, the same question that the visitation of pagan astrologers at the coming of Christ invites us to ask. Is it possible to follow Christ without looking like a Christian? Paul believed that there must be more ways to be Christian than only the Jewish way. That if grace is free, then it can't require us all to fit ourselves to a single uniform way of being. It had to have space for difference, even for us to be uncomfortable with the presence of the other in our midst. For Paul, an encounter with Christ didn't mean leaving behind one's unique way of being in the world in order to fit the Christian mold, but rather retaining one's uniqueness and difference as the very place from which one's journey with Christ takes place. How often, as Christians, we've confused our commission to invite others to follow Christ with making others into the kinds of people that we are. That to be Christian means to look and speak and think and vote like us. How often we've disguised colonialism and cultural genocide as evangelism and mission. On our own land, the church forced indigenous peoples to learn English, to speak and act and dress like settlers. The church couldn't imagine that it was possible to be Christian and Cree, or Christian and Blackfoot or Nakota. We couldn't conceive that being white is not a prerequisite of following Jesus. So much of the most regrettable parts of our history stem from this conflating of Christianity and Christ, this inability to endure the stranger as strange, the other as just that, other than us. Perhaps people's encounter with Christ can actually only happen when we stop policing what is or is not Christian and open ourselves to the journey that others are taking to Christ that looks nothing like ours. The central claim of the Epiphany story that we celebrate every year is that this good news of God in Christ is so good that it cannot be contained to any one religious or cultural framework. It spills over out of the church and into the world in ways that we could never have expected and in places that can only scandalize us. The Magi came to Christ as Magi. They didn't come as Christians and Jews, and they didn't return to their own country as converts. But here's the rub. They went back, the text says, by another road. They returned to the place they came from, but they went back changed. Sometimes I think we treat the gospel as a culture or a way of being, struggling for space in the marketplace of other cultures and religions and meaning systems in our world. We can think that the gospel is always competing for the top spot against other ways of being that try to push it down, like the creeping tide of secularism or the incursion of other faiths. I think, though, that's to misunderstand just how radical this gospel is. Actually, the gospel is non-competitive. As our Anabaptist friends put it, it's peaceable. It coexists, not competes. It examines and critiques and affirms and nourishes what it finds in the best of human culture or human religion. And it does all of that from its rootedness of the revelation of God that we call the Incarnation. The Swiss theologian Karl Barth wrote, "The gospel is not a truth among other truths. Rather, it sets a question mark against all truths." The Magi come to see a baby, and by the time they leave, they see the world differently. They move about in the world differently. They don't just assimilate to some new religion that they've converted to. They go back to the place they came from, but they go back a different way, by a different road. They go back indelibly changed by their encounter with God in Christ. If we are to help people discover what following Jesus means for them, to learn the particular shape of baptismal life in their own context and story, we first have to allow them their own unique journey to Christ. We need to make space for the unexpected ways that people find God and that God finds people. It doesn't do to tell someone that the journey they're taking to Christ will not lead them there, to turn away the magi, because we don't believe in superstitious stuff like star signs and astrology, or to think that faith is only ever compatible with one culture or way of being, or even, dare I say, one kind of politics. Someone's journey to Christ may look radically, distressingly different from my own. And at times we might even be unable to understand how they reconcile their Christian faith with the culture or the ethics that they hold. But it isn't given to us to police other people's faith journeys. We critique and we challenge. We affirm and we nourish. And we maintain an eagerness to be visited by people and ideas and ways of being that are different from our own. Because in that sacred visitation, we find that their difference is the gift that they come bearing to the church. May we have the grace to receive it. Thanks be to God.